August 31, 1928, late afternoon heat, a dusty road that seems to go on forever, and two immigration inspectors driving up toward a farmhouse with a row of chicken coops. A young boy is standing on the porch, and the man who built the place, Gordon Northcott, sees the car and runs into the trees. The boy looks at the inspectors. He knows what telling the truth means. He knows what staying silent means. He chooses to speak. This is where our story begins. Hello, I'm Mara Ellison, and this is Still Unanswered. Today, we return to Southern California in the 1920s to tell the story of what newspapers called the Wineville chicken coop murders, a case that exposed not just a brutal set of crimes on a small ranch, but also how institutions failed victims, how the press shaped panic, and how one mother's insistence on the truth was punished. With me is Dr. Caleb Rios, criminologist and legal historian. Caleb, thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Mara. It's an honor to be here. The Wineville case is one of those moments where criminal behavior and institutional dysfunction collide in a way that's almost archetypal. It's horrific on the ground, but it also tells us a lot about law enforcement, forensic science, and social attitudes in late 1920s California. I'm ready to walk through it with you.
Let's start by setting the scene, Caleb. The mid-1920s in Southern California, boomtowns, sunshine advertising, new suburbs, looks on paper like the American promise. But under that sheen was corruption in the LAPD, sensationalist papers, prohibition crime. How did that environment shape the way people saw a small place like Wineville?
By the mid-1920s, Los Angeles and its surroundings were changing fast. Population was exploding, migration from the Midwest, from other countries, and the city was selling an image: safe, healthy, sunny. But the institutions didn't always keep up. Police departments were often political machines, with patronage and a focus on keeping public order and public perception, sometimes above evidence and procedure. So when a missing child case became a media sensation, the LAPD felt enormous pressure to produce results. That pressure, historically, has the perverse effect of encouraging shortcuts, miscarriages of justice, and, in some cases, active cover-ups. Wineville sits at the edge of that world, close enough to LA to matter in the press, far enough to be out of plain sight.
Right, and into that world comes Gordon Stewart Northcott, born in Saskatchewan in 1906, moved to California as a teenager. He convinces his father to buy a small ranch in Wineville and builds a poultry operation. Coops, a house, outbuildings. On the surface, it looks like a young man trying to make a living. Underneath, the pattern that emerges is chilling. Lures, abuse, murder, the destruction of remains. But before we get to the crimes themselves, tell listeners about early warning signs, how contemporaries later described him, and what we might infer from that.
Contemporaries, his father among them, used words like abnormal and disturbed. In retrospect, you can see behavioral red flags: an intense early fixation with animals, then with control over people, stories of isolation, an unusual relationship with his mother, Sarah Louise, who some accounts describe as emotionally enmeshed. But, and this is crucial, our modern labels like psychopath or sexual sadist have to be applied carefully. There are hints of early trauma or family dysfunction, and there is, from multiple testimonies, a pattern of escalating predatory behavior. In the 1920s, though, there were almost no structural supports, no community interventions, no forensic profiling, and certainly no centralized missing children protocols that would have caught these patterns early.
Which brings us to the boy most central to how the case unfolded: Sanford Wesley Clark. Born in 1913, Gordon's 11-year-old nephew brought from Canada to Wineville under the pretense of opportunity. Sanford ends up, what words can I use here? Coerced, abused, terrified. He isn't just a victim, he's forced to participate in the crimes. Describe what Jessie Clark did, Sanford's sister, and how her actions changed the course of the investigation.
Jessie Clark did something incredibly brave. She traveled from Canada to the ranch because Sanford's letters had stopped sounding like a child at ease. He was withdrawn, frightened. In about a week, she got a confession from him. Sexual abuse, beatings, and at least an assertion that Gordon had murdered boys on the property. Jessie went home, reported it to a U.S. consul, and that diplomatic route is what actually got American officials to the ranch quickly. So one young sister's decision to act, driven by worry, created the initial spark that enabled law enforcement to raid the property. Without that, Sanford may have remained trapped longer, and the discovery might have been delayed or missed entirely.
The inspectors arrive on August 31, 1928. Gordon flees. Sanford delays, fearing Gordon's rifle in the trees. After 2 hours, he breaks. Inspectors detain him for protection, and then the search begins. What did investigators find on that ranch? What I want to emphasize is not whole bodies, but fragments, bones, skull pieces, blood-soaked soil, quicklime, ash. Describe the forensic reality of that era and why identifying victims became so difficult.
Forensics in 1928 was primitive by modern standards. There were trained coroners and pathologists, but no DNA, no stable national databases, limited osteological methods, and little capacity for microscopic or genetic analysis. When investigators found shallow graves and burned bone fragments, bone chips, teeth, bits of clothing, their interpretive tools were blunt. Quicklime, which people believed would speed decomposition, actually makes identification harder because it damages soft tissue and fragilizes bones. Bones that have been burned and crushed can't reliably be matched to missing persons without distinctive items, like dental records, unique jewelry, or eyewitness accounts. That lack of definitive physical linkage created a huge problem in court. The defense could and did sow doubt about whether the fragments belonged to this child or that child, and whether a particular missing boy was actually among the remains.
The incompleteness of remains is a through line in this case. It allows confusion, and, crucially, it lets institutions avoid some accountability. And then there's Christine Collins, the mother who lost her 9-year-old son, Walter, in March 1928 after he vanished going to the movies. She becomes another central figure in this story, not just as a grieving parent, but as someone who pushes back against a police department that wants a tidy win. Tell listeners about Walter's disappearance and the extraordinary arc of Christine's fight.
Walter Collins disappears March 10, 1928. The LAPD launches an enormous search. Newspapers across the country run photographs. By summer, the department is desperate for a positive headline. So when a boy in Illinois shows up claiming to be Walter, the LAPD leaps at the chance. They arrange a public reunion, but Christine, almost immediately, says this boy is not her son. She points to physical differences, height, a genital detail, behaviors, and insists she's certain. The LAPD, frustrated and possibly embarrassed, responds with gaslighting. They tell her trauma has affected her memory, that she should accept the boy and try him out. When she refuses and insists he is an imposter publicly, they have her declared mentally unstable and committed to a psychiatric ward. It's a textbook example, well, a historical example, of institutional power used to silence someone inconvenient.
And the boy later admits he's not Walter. He's Arthur Hutchins Jr., an Iowa youth who wanted to escape his home for a chance at Hollywood. Christine is vindicated, but not restored. She sues the LAPD. She wins judgment, but collecting is another story. There's humiliation, trauma, and no closure about Walter. Meanwhile, on the Wineville ranch, investigators are trying to make sense of Sanford's testimony and the fragments they collected. Gordon flees to Canada with his mother. They're arrested and eventually extradited. A question I always return to is, who actually killed whom? Sarah Louise, Gordon's mother, acts in contradictory ways, confessing, recanting, pleading guilty to Walter's murder, then begging officials to hang her with her son. How should we read Sarah's actions?
Sarah is a complicated figure. On one hand, testimony indicates she participated in the cover-ups, helping to dig graves and later exhume and further destroy remains. On the other hand, her confessions are inconsistent. She alternates between full admissions of guilt and wild recantations that include tales of incest and family abuse. There are several plausible readings. She could be a manipulative, complicit actor who tried to protect Gordon or control the narrative. She could be profoundly traumatized, mentally unstable, and caught in a pattern of self-sacrifice and denial. She could also have been trying to take responsibility, to put herself between the state and her son. The record supports elements of all three interpretations, and the truth is likely messy. Legally, her guilty plea to Walter's murder meant she received a life sentence and spared the state the difficulty of a contested trial. Morally, it leaves us with more questions than answers about culpability and coercion.
And then there's Sanford, forced to watch and to do things no child should be asked to do. Prosecutors ultimately treated him as a victim rather than a murderer. He was sent to Whittier State School, later released, and went on to a life away from headlines. His testimony, however, was central to convicting Gordon of 3 murders: the Winslow boys, Lewis and Nelson, and the so-called Headless Mexican. That last label, Headless Mexican, is a reminder of how some victims were dehumanized in the reporting and record-keeping of the time. Caleb, can you speak to how race and class affected which victims were identified and which were reduced to anonymous statistics?
Absolutely. The case reveals a harsh hierarchy of whose deaths mattered most in public and in court. The Winslow boys were from Pomona, white, middle class, and their disappearance drew sympathetic press coverage. The so-called Headless Mexican, a teenager or young man of Mexican descent, was referred to in dehumanizing terms and, in several records, never fully identified or sought with the same vigor. That reflects broader patterns in early 20th century America. Marginalized communities, immigrants, racial minorities, the poor, received less investigative attention, less public outrage, and often fewer resources for identification. The language used, Headless Mexican, is a chilling shorthand that erases personhood, and it made it easier for institutions and the press to focus on certain narratives, the missing white child, the heroic rescue, while leaving other victims anonymous.
It's painful to name that out loud, but necessary. Let's talk about the trials. Sarah pleads guilty to 1 murder and is sentenced to life. Gordon is tried in Riverside for 3 murders, based largely on Sanford's testimony and the forensic fragments. The trial ran 27 days. The jury convicts him and sentences him to death. There's even an attempted lynch mob outside the jail. Caleb, from a legal historian's perspective, what were the critical weaknesses and strengths of the prosecution's case, and why did prosecutors decide not to prosecute Gordon for Walter Collins's murder?
The prosecution's strongest evidence was Sanford's detailed eyewitness testimony. He described events, locations, and methods in a way that corroborated physical evidence found on the ranch. They also had fragments of bone and personal effects that connected to missing boys. The weaknesses, by modern standards, were the fragmentary nature of the physical evidence and the lack of corroborative forensic science that could definitively tie remains to specific victims. Prosecutors were strategic, charging Gordon for the 3 cases where they thought they had the best combination of testimony and physical evidence, in part because Sarah had already pled guilty to Walter's murder. Pursuing Walter's murder in court would have required more definitive proof, and the state apparently judged it unnecessary when they could secure convictions and the death penalty on the other 3 counts. That decision raised real moral and procedural questions, chief among them being why didn't the state pursue truth for Christine instead of using Sarah's plea as closure?
It's a bitter irony. Christine's case helped propel public attention so the LAPD could claim success, and yet the department also used that success to justify silencing her. The trials concluded with Gordon's execution in 1930 at San Quentin. He was 23. Before his death, he allegedly hinted at more victims, but refused to give full details, keeping the tally uncertain. That ambiguity, did he kill 9, 20, is one of the episode's largest unanswered threads. Caleb, what do you make of Gordon's fluctuating confessions?
People who commit serial violence sometimes inflate or deflate their own numbers for psychological reasons, to create mystique, to regain control, to bargain for sympathy or attention. Gordon's shifting statements could have been attempts to manipulate investigators, to elevate his infamy, or to protect himself or others. Alternatively, the inconsistent testimony might reflect his unstable mental state, or simply the poor interviewing techniques of the period that led him to contradict himself under stress. Bottom line, without additional physical evidence, fluctuating confessions are unreliable as a ledger of victims. They tell us more about his psychology and about the hunger of the press for a neat, horrifying tally.
And that hunger changed a town. Wineville, shamed and stigmatized, changed its name to Mira Loma in 1930. But names and signs can't erase trauma. Families never received full closure. Christine died in 1964, still without conclusive proof of Walter's fate. Sanford went on, lived quietly, and died in 1991. There's an ethical question here that our show often faces. If we were able to, should modern investigators reopen the case? Could DNA, ground-penetrating radar, or genetic genealogy give families answers a century later? Caleb, let's walk through the practical possibilities and the obstacles.
From a technical standpoint, there are promising tools. If any of the bone fragments, teeth, or tissue samples from the original investigation were preserved in evidence lockers, and that's a big if given decades of storage practices, modern DNA analysis could be performed. Teeth often yield mitochondrial DNA, and bone shafts can sometimes yield nuclear DNA. Genetic genealogy could connect unidentified remains to living relatives. Ground-penetrating radar on the property could indicate unmarked graves. But the obstacles are substantial. Chain of custody and preservation of materials are often broken in cases this old. The original sites may now be private property or developed land. And coordinating exhumations requires legal authority, funding, and the consent or involvement of possible descendant families. Even if you clear those hurdles, degraded DNA and contamination complicate analyses. The potential is real, but it's neither easy nor guaranteed.
Those are tough practicalities, yet the moral question remains. For whom would we reopen it? For Christine? For the Winslow family? For the headless Mexican whose name was never in the record? For Sanford? For the community that erased its own name? Personally, I think if there are remains, if there are bones in an evidence locker, there is an obligation to try. But it's not just a technical procedure, it's also a political and ethical decision. If we exhume and identify, we have to prepare families for outcomes we can't control. How do we balance that?
It's exactly that balance. The decision to reopen should be victim-centered. You need outreach to descendant communities, transparent processes about what tests can show and cannot show, and mental health resources for families. Legally, a district attorney or coroner would typically have to authorize exhumations or testing. Sometimes courts are involved. Funding is also crucial. Genealogical and DNA testing aren't free. There's a moral imperative to try, especially for marginalized victims whose identities were erased. But the process must be handled with sensitivity and honesty about the limits of science.
Let me pause here and ask you directly, Caleb. Given everything we know, the fragments, Sanford's testimony, Gordon's inconsistent confessions, what's your best, careful estimate of how many victims might reasonably be attributed to Northcott?
I want to be cautious because historical estimates can become definitive in the public mind even when they're speculative. Officially, he was convicted of 3 murders, with Sarah the plea adding another. Contemporary investigators and the press at the time speculated up to 20, but that number was more rumor than evidence. Based on the known missing boys from the period, the documented graves and burned fragments, and his own admissions at various times, it's reasonable to think there were at least 4 or 5 victims linked directly to the ranch, and possibly more. But saying 20 requires proof we don't have. I'd frame it as a credible range. Confirmed victims of 3 to 4 in the record, plausible additional victims up to perhaps 8 or 10 based on circumstantial evidence, and beyond that, it's conjecture.
Thank you. That cautious framing matters. I want to return to Christine Collins for a moment. Her treatment by the LAPD reads now like institutional punishment for being right. She speaks up, they silence her. She sues and wins, but most of the judgment is never enforced. That story inspired Clint Eastwood's film Changeling, a dramatization that focuses on Christine and the LAPD's corruption. Caleb, do you think dramatizations like Changeling help public understanding, or do they risk simplifying or sensationalizing? How should storytellers handle material like this?
Dramatizations can bring attention to historical injustice in ways academic articles cannot. Changeling put Christine's nightmare in front of a modern audience and forced a conversation about police power and mothers fighting for their children. That said, films compress and invent for narrative flow, which risks shaping public memory in ways that privilege emotional arc over nuance. Good dramatizations should be accompanied by context notes, interviews, or supplemental material that explain where filmmakers took creative license. In true crime storytelling, there's also an ethical duty to avoid glorifying perpetrators and instead center victims and systemic failures. Changeling does that in part, but it's still a film, so we, as journalists and historians, must keep digging beyond the dramatization.
Exactly. And on that note, it's worth saying again how essential Jesse Clark's actions were. A sister refused to accept silence, and her letters to an American consular official are what brought investigators to the ranch. Sanford later lived decades away from the spotlight. Christine carried uncertainty her entire life. Sarah Louise died in prison. Gordon was executed. But the record remains fragmentary, both literally and narratively. Caleb, from a reform standpoint, do you see lessons from this case that influenced how police handled missing children or forensic evidence later on?
Yes, in aggregate. The 1920s were a period of patchwork practices, and cases like Wineville, especially when subjected to public outrage, created pressure for better methods. Over the following decades, we see gradual professionalization, More systematic coroner practices, better crime scene protocols, the rise of juvenile protections, and eventually centralized missing persons databases and forensic advancements after World War II and into the late 20th century. But change is incremental and driven by many cases. Wineville is one part of the mosaic that, along with other scandals and investigative failures, pushed law enforcement to adopt more rigorous procedures. Importantly, it also underlines how media pressure can both help and harm investigations, something reformers have tried to address through policy and protocol.
One more legal question, Caleb, about Christine's involuntary commitment. At the time, how easy was it for police to have someone declared mentally unstable, and would there have been safeguards?
In the 1920s, psychiatric commitment laws were far less protective. Commitments could be initiated with relative ease if authorities gathered some medical testimony or even affidavits asserting instability. The stigma against women who challenged male authority, especially police officials, meant that obstinacy could be reframed as hysteria or instability. Safeguards existed, but they were weaker, and courts tended to defer to medical or police judgments. Christine's case is a potent illustration of power imbalances, where a mother who publicly questioned the police was treated not as a citizen with rights, but as a problem to be locked away.
And that abuse of power had real consequences for public trust. Returning to the physical site, Wineville's name was changed to Mira Loma. Today, the area is Jurupa Valley or Eastvale. The landscape shifted, but addresses like Wineville Avenue persist. Should communities that inherit these histories be compelled to remember them, or is there a case to be made for moving on? How do we balance a town's desire to escape stigma with the need to honor victims?
That's a question that every community with a traumatic past has to wrestle with. On one hand, changing a town's name or downplaying a history is a social response to stigma and a desire for renewal. On the other hand, erasing names without acknowledgement risks forgetting victims and preventing communal reckoning. I think a balanced approach is to acknowledge the past respectfully, memorials, historical markers, educational resources, so that forgetting doesn't translate into erasure. Communities can move forward while still maintaining institutional memory and honoring those who suffered.
Before we move into the final reflection, I want to ask a practical, almost forensic question that listeners might be curious about. Those bone fragments, do we know if anything was preserved? Is there an evidence locker somewhere? Could a modern DA contact archives and find material to test?
There are cases where material has been preserved in county coroner files or police evidence lockers, sometimes by luck. In other instances, material was lost, destroyed, or improperly archived. For Wineville, some fragments were cataloged and referenced in trial transcripts and coroner reports, so we at least have a paper trail of what existed. Finding physical evidence today would require a survey of Riverside County coroner records, county archives, and state museum or university collections that sometimes receive such items. A modern DA or academic with institutional backing could start that search. Whether anything viable for DNA testing remains would only be revealed after careful inventory and scientific appraisal.
So there's a path, however thin. It would take curiosity, funding, and the will to push through bureaucratic barriers. As we approach the end, Caleb, I want to ask you to weigh in on a broader moral question. When we retell cases like Wineville, how do we avoid exploiting suffering while still pressing on for answers and accountability?
We need to center victims and survivors. Use names, not sensational nicknames. Tell what we know, acknowledge what we don't. Emphasize institutional lessons as much as horrific details, and be transparent about sources and limitations. Respectful storytelling also means providing context about the social forces that allowed abuse to persist, about the failures of institutions, and about the lived aftermath for families. It's not enough to shock. We must also illuminate, and whenever possible, involve descendants and communities in decisions about how the story is told.
I want to close with an image. Back at that ranch on August 31, Sanford had a clear decision. He could keep silent and try to survive another day, or he could speak and set in motion an investigation that would cost him his childhood. He spoke. Jussie pushed for him. Christine refused to be silenced. Those acts of courage are our connective tissue to the lost boys. Caleb, any final thoughts about what still matters in cases like this?
Yes. First, remember that investigations are never only about facts. They're about people. We should never reduce victims to statistics. Second, institutionally, transparency and accountability matter because they prevent the abuses of power we saw with Christine Collins. Third, the possibility of science giving answers is real, but it's a tool. What matters is whether we use it to serve victims, not spectacle. Finally, these cases remind us to listen to the marginalized, because sometimes the people most likely to be ignored are the ones who need us to pay attention the most.
Thank you, Caleb. For listeners who want to go deeper, we'll link sources from archival newspapers, trial transcripts, and the secondary literature in today's episode notes, including the book by James Jeffrey Paul and historical pieces that detail the trial and its aftermath. If you are sensitive to content about child abuse and violence, please take care. This episode tried to avoid gratuitous detail, but the subject matter is inherently upsetting. If today's show raises strong emotions for you, we've included resources in the episode notes.
One small practical note before we sign off. If anyone listening has family lore about a missing relative in Southern California in the late 1920s, or access to old family photos that match the descriptions of missing boys, those kinds of community contributions can be crucial. Because identifying victims often begins with small, patient leads from the public.
We'll end where we began. At the moment Sanford decided to tell. It's a reminder that sometimes the most consequential acts are the quiet, terrifying ones. A child choosing truth over fear. A sister traveling across a border to force officials to look. A mother refusing to accept a lie. The Wineville chicken coop murders are more than an episode in a true crime anthology. They're a case study in how systems can fail the most vulnerable, and how the unanswered questions can haunt families and communities for generations. Thank you, Caleb, for joining me and for helping us hold the complexity of this story rather than simplifying it into horror. And thank you, listeners, for being with us. I'm Mara Ellison. This has been Still Unanswered.
Thank you, Mara. And to everyone listening, remember the names behind the headlines. That's how we honor them.